I believe we can start. We are going to look at anatomy of the sensory systems. In this lecture, it will be largely revolving around sensory receptors and their related sensory pathways. We'll have this lecture in two parts. So we'll do one half today and another half will continue another day. The key objectives of the lecture are to state the type of sensations. We are also going to give examples of sensory receptors, and we are going to classify the sensory receptors as well. We will then look at the general sensations and state their related sensory pathways. We'll also look at the organs and receptors of spatial sensations, and we'll talk about their related sensory pathways. Let's begin by defining a few things. One of the things I want us to define is sensation. The term sensation simply means the state of awareness of a stimulus. That stimulus can be from the external part of the body or from within the body. As long as you are aware of that stimulus, then we say you've sensed the stimulus. So sensation is the state of awareness of a stimulus. We classify sensations into two. We have spatial sensations and general sensations. When you talk of spatial sensations, we are referring to vision, smell, taste, hearing, and equilibrium. This is largely equilibrium of the head. The sensations which don't fall under these 5 categories are therefore considered general. These general sensations can further be classified based on where they are detected from. Those which are detected from visceral organs, from internal organs, such as maybe you are detecting from the stomach, are called visceral sensations, as opposed to the ones you are detecting from maybe the skin, which are called somatic sensations. So what are examples of visceral sensations? Visceral sensations include things like stretch. You know, when you've eaten and you've taken a lot of githeri, your stomach is distended. So that one, that stretch. Could also be blood pressure sensation. Those are visceral sensations. It could also be visceral pain. Pain can be visceral or somatic. So sensations which are detected from internal organs are visceral sensations. Somatic sensations are sensations which are detected from the body wall. They can either be detected from the skin or from muscles. If you detect them from skin, then you call them cutaneous sensations. Examples of cutaneous sensations would be sensations of touch, pressure, pain, and temperature, which could either be cold or heat. Those are cutaneous sensations that are detected from the skin, as opposed to the ones which are detected beyond the skin, which we just call deep sensations. Deep sensations include proprioception and vibration. Proprioception is the sense of position, the sense of orientation in space. You being aware that you are standing or seated or lying down, even without checking with your eyes. The sense of spatial orientation. Vibration is also detected deep below the skin. Great, so that is the first thing that we are defining. We've defined sensation. We've also looked at different types of sensations. The second thing I want us to define is sensory receptor. So what are sensory receptor? A sensory receptor is a specialist neuron or epithelial cell that can detect environmental stimulus. A specialized neuron or epithelial cell that can detect environmental stimulus. That is a sensory receptor. What is fundamental about sensory receptors is that they can convert environmental stimulus into nerve impulses. That's very critical. A sensory receptor must be able to convert whatever form of environmental energy into action potentials. So that if something cannot convert an environmental energy into action potential, then it is not a sensory receptor. And if something can convert environmental stimulus into action potential, then it qualifies to be called a sensory receptor. These are usually some specialized neurons or specialized epithelial cells. We classify sensory receptors based on the type of environmental energy that stimulate them. The ones which are stimulated by mechanical energy are therefore called mechanoreceptors. So it means that they convert the mechanical energy into nerve impulses. So things like touch, receptors for touch are mechanoreceptors, receptors for pressure are mechanoreceptors, receptors for vibration are mechanoreceptors. We can also have thermoreceptors, which means they are stimulated by either cold or heat. We can have chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors include receptors for taste. You taste chemicals. They also include receptors for smell. You smell chemicals. Osmoreceptors, receptors for oxygen, all those are chemoreceptors. Photoreceptors are receptors for light. And if something is being stimulated by noxious stimulus, we call them nociceptors. Therefore, nociceptors are receptors for pain. So this is how we classify sensory receptors. And so that is the second thing we're defining. We've defined what a sensory receptor is, and I've given you different classes of sensory receptors. The third thing I want us to define is sensory organ. What is a sensory organ? A sensory organ is any organ that houses a sensory receptor. For example, the skin would be a sensory organ. And why do you say so? Because the skin contains receptors for many types of sensations. Receptors for heat, receptors for pain, receptors for vibration, receptors for touch, they're found on the skin. So the skin qualifies to be called a sensory organ. Apart from the skin, we also have other types of sensory organs. And I want to give you a chance to write for me other examples of sensory organs. Just write on the chat, I'll see. I'm the only one who's able to see what you'll have written. Okay, let me make it public so that you don't have to repeat the same things. So you just name one organ, which is a sensory organ. Okay, write on the chat. So that summarizes the things I wanted us to define. We've defined sensation, we've defined sensory receptor, and we've defined sensory organ. Now let's talk about receptors of general sensation. So we have receptors of general sensations. There are many receptors of general sensation. Merkel's disc is a receptor of general sensation. It's found on the skin. Hair follicle, nerve terminal around hair follicle. Nerve terminal around hair follicle is a receptor for general sensation. Pacinian corpuscle is a receptor for general sensation. Free nerve endings are receptors for general sensation. Ruffini terminals are receptors. For general sensation, we have Meissner's corpuscles are also receptors of general sensation. The Krauss end bulb is a receptor for general sensation. I want to give you time in your groups to discuss the sensory modalities that those receptors detect. We'd already done this some time back when you're doing the integument system. So welcome back. I believe you've done that well. Apart from those receptors which are on the skin, we also have some receptors which are deep. They're largely within the muscle, so they're deep sensations. Two types of receptors are deep in the muscle. We have what we call the Golgi tendon organ, as well as what we call the muscle spindle. Golgi tendon organ is found at the junction between muscle and tendon. This receptor is sensitive to tension within muscle. So it's sensitive to muscle tension. Then we have this one that we're calling muscle spindle. Muscle spindle is found within skeletal muscles. Some books call it neuromuscular spindle. It is found within skeletal muscles. This receptor is sensitive to stretch of muscle, as well as the speed at which that muscle is being stretched. Why does the body need this information regarding tension, stretch, and speed of stretch? That information helps the body to then know the position of joints and muscles. And for that reason, these two types of receptors are therefore receptors for proprioception. They are proprioceptors, these two, Golgi tendon organ and muscle spindle. They are receptors for proprioception. Let's look at how sensations are relayed to the brain after they've been detected by their sensory receptors. We've agreed that sensory receptors detect the sensations. So irrespective of the type of stimuli that goes to them, it could be vibration, it could be pain, could be temperature, could be touch, pressure, whatever it is. These sensory receptors detect the stimuli. Once they detect the stimuli, they take the stimuli to the cerebral cortex. Now, I hope you remember that story. And the other story that I want to remember also is that from the sensory receptors to the cerebral cortex, it wasn't just a journey of one neuron. It's a journey of 3 neurons in relay, 3 neurons in series. The first neuron is what we called the primary sensory neuron. The primary sensory neuron is also what we call the first order sensory neuron. What does that neuron do? That neuron carries signals from the sensory receptor to the spinal cord or the brainstem. For that reason, this neuron will most likely have its cell body outside the central nervous system. Many of such neurons will then have their cell bodies in one collection that we then called sensory ganglion. So the first order neuron is the one that forms sensory ganglion. Well, so the dendrites will come from the receptor, then the cell body will be somewhere in the middle, and then the axon will enter the spinal cord or brainstem. It can terminate in the spinal cord or can terminate in the brainstem. It terminates by synapsing with the second order sensory neuron. And 2 things we mentioned about the second order sensory neuron. The second order sensory neuron decussates. To decussate is to cross over. If it was on the right, to go to the left. If it was on the left, to go to the right. Apart from decussation, the other thing the second order sensory neuron does is that it reaches the thalamus. And from the thalamus, then we have the third order sensory neuron. Therefore, third order sensory neuron can just be called thalamocortical radiations. They come from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, thalamocortical radiation. Why do these sensations go to the cerebral cortex? They'll go to the cerebral cortex for the purpose of interpretation, for the purpose of perception. Of course, there are other things that will also happen in the cerebral cortex. Can be interpreted, can then be recognized, can register memory, can also initiate a response. But let's keep it to the level of interpretation. So this system of neurons that come from the receptors to the cerebral cortex are the ones we call the afferent nerve system, or others call the sensory systems. Because these neurons go up to the cerebral cortex from the peripheries, we can also call them the ascending pathways, or what we called yesterday ascending tracts. So let's see, what are these ascending pathways? There are a number of them. I'll just give you examples. So I want us to look at how these sensations go to the brain. And we can use this one. This one is with regard to temperature. That means maybe it's heat. So once you have heat, now this is on the lower limb, as you can see, there'll be receptors there for heat. the receptors for heat will convert that to action potentials, which are then carried via the primary sensory neuron. If the sensation is about heat, then those neurons will enter. First of all, the first order sensory neuron is a stereounipolar neuron, as you can see, which means the cell body of this neuron is somewhere outside the central nervous system to form ganglion, if there are many. The axon of the neuron then enters, and as you remember, they enter through the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. The ones that are concerned with temperature, pain, pressure, and touch. Pain, temperature, pressure, and touch behave the same way. And this is what they do. They enter, they reach the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, the synapse there. The synapse is the second order sensory neuron. Second order sensory neuron decussate first. After the decussation, it will now have crossed to the opposite side of the spinal cord. It will then ascend on the anterolateral aspect of the spinal cord, all the way to the thalamus. And that is what we called the spinothalamic tract. From the spinal cord to the thalamus. That's what we call the spinothalamic tract. It doesn't matter whether it's come from the lower limb or from the upper limb. The story is the same. How about if the sensation is concerning vibration or proprioception or fine touch? Fine touch, vibration, and proprioception. How will they go? Now, this is how they go. The receptors for fine touch are Meissner's corpuscles. Receptors for vibration are Pacinian corpuscles. Receptors for proprioception are the GTO, Golgi tendon organ, as well as the muscle spindle. The neurons behave the same. This is how they behave. So from the receptor, the first order sensory neuron, its cell body is outside the CNS, that's okay. Then the axon enters. Now the axon enters through the dorsal root, yes, but doesn't synapse there. The axons occupy the dorsal column of the spinal cord. And because they are still first order neurons, they will not decussate yet. They'll climb on the same side of the spinal cord all the way to the medulla oblongata. Remember, I told you that first order sensory neurons can terminate in the spinal cord or brainstem. So these ones terminate in the medulla oblongata. And doesn't matter whether they come from the upper limb or from the lower limb. That's how they behave, as long as it is fine touch, proprioception, and vibration. So the moment they reach the medulla oblongata, they then synapse with the second order neuron, which then crosses the midline, decussate, then ascend on the opposite side, all the way to the thalamus again. That will have a unique name, but you don't have to go into that name. From the thalamus, we'll have third order neurons that go to the cerebral cortex. So when they're passing through the spinal cord, these are the ones we called yesterday the dorsal column pathway. And we agreed that if they come from the lower parts of the body, then you'll call that fasciculus gracilis. And they come from the upper part of the body, you call them fasciculus cuneatus. So that is how the general sensations are relayed to the cerebral cortex. Remember what we mentioned? The dorsal columns are on the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. We'll have fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. These ones carry sensations regarding vibration, proprioception, and fine touch. Spinothalamic pathway, on the other hand, is anterolateral aspect of the spinal cord. They are second-order sensory neurons, as opposed to dorsal columns, which are first-order sensory neurons. These ones are second-order sensory neurons. They carry information regarding pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure. The other type of tracts that we mentioned that we haven't talked about were the spinocerebellar tracts, which carry information regarding unconscious proprioception. So the receptors are still the proprioceptors, except that now these ones go to the cerebellum. Good. Now I've finished with general sensations. I want us to talk about special sensations, and we'll just talk about two special sensations today. So here we're going to look at receptors of special sensations. We are going to look at sensory pathways for the special sensations. Remember, the special sensations we have in mind are olfaction, taste, hearing, equilibrium, and vision. We'll only look at the first two today: olfaction and taste sensation. So, olfactory sensation. Olfaction is detected by olfactory epithelium. Olfactory epithelium is the receptor for smell. This epithelium is located on the upper part of the nasal cavity. So I saw some of you writing that the nose is a sensory organ. That's okay, because it contains the receptors for smell. But remember, the nose will still send some things. Well, you still have pain receptors in the nose, I believe. So where exactly is the olfactory epithelium located? In this upper part of the nasal cavity. In this upper part of the nasal cavity, the olfactory epithelium occupies the roof of the nasal cavity. It also occupies the upper part of the nasal septum, as well as the upper part of the lateral wall of the nose. So the roof, the upper part of the lateral wall, and the upper part of the nasal septum. Olfactory epithelium contain chemoreceptor cells. These chemoreceptor cells can detect chemicals within the air that you're breathing in. And through that, because they're able to convert them to action potentials, you are able to sense these chemicals. The impulses that come from the chemoreceptor cells are relayed through the first cranial nerve, which is the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve traverses the roof of the nasal cavity through some tiny holes within the ethmoid bone. That perforated ethmoid bone is what we call the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Those are the foramina that these neurons use to reach the olfactory bulb. So there are usually about 20 nervelets that come from the roof of the nasal cavity to the cranial cavity. So I want to ask you a question here. I'll give it to you on the poll. You have it with you, and you have 30 seconds. So I'll stop it there. most of you have gotten it wrong. And this one we just did this week. So when the first order sensory neurons for olfaction cross the cribriform plate, they synapse in a region called the olfactory bulb. So there, they'll synapse the second order sensory neurons for olfaction. These second order sensory neurons for olfaction have their cell bodies within the olfactory bulb. Their axons then go to the brain, and that is what constitutes what we call the olfactory tract, which goes to the brain. Olfaction is the only sensation that does not go through thalamus before it reaches the cerebral cortex. Olfaction reaches the cerebral cortex before it can connect to the thalamus. And so when we talk about olfaction, we'll not talk about 3 orders of neurons. We will only talk about 2 orders of neurons. The first order neuron are the ones we are calling the olfactory nerve. The second order neurons are the ones we are calling the olfactory tract. And so the olfactory tract reaches the cerebral cortex, and the cortex that receive olfactory sensation is the temporal lobe. I've seen some of you writing frontal lobe. We agreed on the key functions of frontal lobe: voluntary movements, motor speech, and cognitive functions. We also agreed on the functions of the temporal lobe. We agreed on functions of parietal lobe, functions of occipital lobe. At least nobody said occipital lobe. Okay, so the region of the temporal lobe that actually receives this olfactory information is what we had called earlier the piriform cortex, or the piriform lobe, area number 28 and area number 34. That's the region that we are referring to as the primary olfactory cortex. That is olfaction pathway. So this was the primary olfactory cortex. Maybe I didn't show you this image earlier, but that's olfactory bulb, this olfactory tract. Olfactory tract projects the cerebral cortex here. This is the primary olfactory area, the piriform cortex. This is area number 28, and this is area number 34. The second special sensation is sensation of taste. So what are we able to taste? We're able to taste sweet, something that is sweet, we're able to taste that. We're able to taste something that is sour. We're able to taste something that's bitter. You can also have salty taste, and you can have umami taste. It is umami, not umama. Umami taste is the meaty taste, the taste of meat. Now, you'll be told that there are some regions of the tongue that are more sensitive to that different types of sensations. That's okay. But don't be restricted to this map. You can still feel saltiness here. The same way you can still feel something that is sweet here. But this graphic shows the region with highest susceptibility for particular type of sensations. Before we talk about taste pathway, let's talk about anatomy of the tongue. So the tongue has a tip here and its body. The body of the tongue has 2 parts. The anterior 2/3 of the tongue is largely found within the mouth. And so we call it the oral tongue, the tongue in the mouth. The posterior 1/3 of the tongue is largely found within the pharynx, within the throat. So we call it the pharyngeal tongue. We have oral tongue and pharyngeal tongue. The junction between the two is usually a small depression, a line that is usually present in form of a V like that. You may not see it easily. On the surface of the tongue, the surface is not very smooth. There are projections on the surface of the tongue. Those projections on the surface of the tongue, however tiny they are called the papillae. If you are to magnify one of those projections, it will look like this under a microscope. There are 4 types of papillae on the tongue. The circumvallate papilla is the one that looks like this. There are projections. Those ones are largely found on the posterior aspects, just in front of that line that I told you about. These are the circumvallate papilla. They can be so big. When you see one, they're difficult to see, but when you see one, you might confuse it for a pimple or something. They're prominent. Apart from circumvallate papillae, we also have what you call fungiform papillae. Perhaps they're the second biggest. They're found all over in the anterior tongue. They look like the top of a mushroom. You know, the mushroom before it turns, or the top of an umbrella, kind of. The third type are the filiform papilla. Filiform papilla are the majority, very tiny, sharp, projecting all over the tongue. Those are filiform papilla, they're the majority. But lastly, you have the foliate papilla. Foliate papilla are only found in the lateral aspect of the tongue. They appear as lines, and they are not well developed in humans per se. Why am I telling you about the papillae? So if you have a papilla, then it means you'll have a groove. These grooves are very important because they're the ones that collect chemicals or fluid with chemicals. And so next to those grooves are usually things which look like this. Those white ovoid structures, tiny, which we call the taste buds. So the papillary systems of the tongue contain taste buds adjacent to the grooves. A taste bud will look like this, and if drawn, the taste buds are the receptors for taste. So taste sensation will be detected by taste buds. Taste buds have chemoreceptors. After that detection, the information regarding taste is relayed to the brainstem via 3 types of cranial nerves. The 7th cranial nerve, which is facial nerve, arises from, there are branches of facial nerve, which come from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So the taste buds from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue relay their information to the brain via the facial nerve, which is the 7th cranial nerve. The taste buds from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the pharyngeal tongue, relay their sensations through the glossopharyngeal nerve, the 9th cranial nerve. Apart from taste buds in the tongue, either anterior or posterior tongue, we also have taste buds around the epiglottis. The taste buds around the epiglottis are innervated by the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve. So whether the information comes through facial nerve from the anterior tooth of the tongue, glossopharyngeal from posterior one of the tongue, or vagus from the region around the epiglottis. Those are all primary order sensory neurons. Their signals terminate in the brainstem. From there, we have second order sensory neurons for taste. So what will they do first? They'll cross over, they decussate. After they have decussated, then they'll climb on the opposite side of the brainstem all the way to the thalamus. So these are second order sensory neurons for taste sensation. From the thalamus, we'll have the thalamocortical projection, which means third order sensory neuron from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. The region of the cerebral cortex that will be receiving these sensations regarding taste is the parietal cortex. It is the one that houses the primary gustatory area, area number 43. That area number 43 is in the parietal cortex adjacent to the insular cortex. And if you remember, we mentioned it as para-insular region, area number 43. Also remember that according to the homunculus diagram, the head region and the tongue will be somewhere here. That's why taste goes somewhere there and not somewhere there. Great, so that is sensation regarding taste. And I'll stop there. We agreed that we'll pick from there next time. So sensation regarding hearing, equilibrium, as well as vision, we'll do that in the next session. If I start this, I'll not be able to finish, so we'll just stop there.